sit back in your seats, get something to eat, and watch this movie. Don't let the kiddies see it, because, well, we'll let you hear the beginning first. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Left of the Projector. I am your host, Evan, back again with another film discussion from the left. I'm happy to announce that you can now sign up and be a paid subscriber to the show directly from Spotify, so you can just pop on there and support the show. Also, if you would be so kind as to smash that ratings button on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this show right now. As always, you can follow the show on TikTok and Instagram at Left of the Projector Pod. Enjoy the show. All right, we will get into the discussion this week on the second installment of Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. And with me again to discuss this film is Hungry Rye. Thank you for joining me today.
Yes, thank you for having me again. Hopefully this goes over well. I know the last one got received really well, which is very exciting. So I'm happy to be able to do another installment of this.
Yes, there was lots of clamoring for when is the next one going to be released. And so just as a aside, anyone who hasn't listened to the first episode of this 3-part series on the Lord of the Rings films, you can go back and do so on any Spotify podcast platform of your choice. But I think a good place to start with this movie, just because it's been at the top of my mind as I started kind of sketching out some notes, is the kind of the political climate. So this movie came out in 2002 around Christmas time. And for anyone who remembers, that was the same time as the Iraq War starting. And so there was a big push by the media, or sort of undertones in the media and interviews with the cast, to try and compare this movie, or as a allegory towards what we were fighting in Iraq, the quote unquote terrorists. So I don't know, what do you make of their they're trying to co-opt this great work?
What do I make of it? I think it makes sense. I think a lot of film and media at that time, where we were accelerating into this like hyper American exceptionalist society, with having George W. Bush as our president, I think it makes sense why we were having those sentiments and why people were trying to push that narrative onto like film and media. And I think it also makes sense why we had a lot of pushback against like different celebrities who were speaking out against it, like Vigo,
Yes,
who plays Aragorn. And I think you have the quote up exactly of like why he wore the "no more wars for oil" or "no more blood for oil" in his interview that he had with all of the cast members, right?
Yeah, so he was on Charlie Rose in 2002 promoting the movie, and he came on, like you said, with the shirt that said, no blood for oil. And he, there's a whole, he goes on for a long time, and Charlie Rose is really pushing him, as, I guess that's he's meant to do in an interview. But he basically said, this is, so I'll read a couple of the quotes. He says, "I don't think that The Two Towers or Tolkien's writings have anything to do with the United States foreign ventures, and it upsets me to hear that." So immediately off the bat, he's saying, I'm not going to, this isn't meant to be. And he says, whereas in The Two Towers, you had different races, nations, cultures coming together, examining their conscience and unifying against a very real, terrifying enemy. And what the United States has been doing has been bombing innocent civilians without coming anywhere close to catching Osama bin Laden or the presumed enemies. And then he says that he thinks that the U.S. government would be viewed as Saruman to the people in the Middle East. So he does not mince words at all.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it needs to be brought up in the sense that, Peter Jackson, not Peter Jackson, Tolkien, was writing these books during World War II. And so obviously he had these thoughts in his head, but I don't think it's fair to compare the two. But like you said, I think it makes sense why they would do that. Everything was very patriotic. I remember you couldn't drive anywhere without a person, a family having a flag in their driveway. It was very much, country coming together, and they wanted to use media, and entertainment to help solidify that support.
Yeah, and like even like it went as far as like Peter Jackson being really conscious of how he was going to depict the collapse of the tower that like Sauron was like his eye was on, so because it was so closely, any building falling was going to be very triggering to
Hmm.
see on a large screen because of what we had watched on 9/11. But it's just interesting to see like how Tolkien's work was heavily reflective of like World War II, and Peter Jackson's work also, it still was influenced by contemporary issues. And I think it's a really important part because people always push back like, oh, separate, make it apolitical. And it's like, you can't.
Right.
Like we can still look at stuff like this, and it's kind of, it helps reiterate or reinforce the points that we're making as we're using this as allegories for Marxism and like the material reality that we live in.
Yeah, and I think it puts it into perspective. Looking at that historical, the climate, at the time. And I'm not going to go too much further into this, but I found an article from I think this past year, basically saying how the Lord of the Rings helped sort of the people in the United States collectively get us through 9/11. And while that might be true for some people, kind of having this feeling when they watch the movie of being, together, fighting together against the common enemy, I don't subscribe to that sentiment personally. But again, I think I understand why you would say that.
Yeah, when you're only being fed one narrative about what is happening, why it's happening, what caused it to happen, not realize it's a circle of the US intervening, meddling in foreign affairs as a means to prop themselves up via imperialism and neocolonialism, and then like stuff like bad things happen here because of that, and then we don't understand it because we're not being educated on it, so people cling to things that like make them feel better about the situation without knowing like the full historical reason.
Yeah, and I think one last thing, and then we'll move on from this thing. I think that, to be honest, I was telling this to someone, or maybe someone commented. I posted the video of this online, the Vigo interview, and it was pretty brave for people to come out. I don't want to say like any old person, but people obviously were protesting the war. But celebrities and people coming out against the war because it was a very unpopular opinion to have, especially publicly, as people were being kind of told, okay, you need to stop doing that, and he wasn't going to do that. So Vigo, we salute you for that.
Yeah, because I mean, if you see what happened with the Dixie Chicks, like they completely got blacklisted.
Yep.
Like it could end your career in any form of media, and like people would remember you by that. It was a crazy time to like look back and think that we did that. Hashtag cancel culture.
Right. They changed their name because of that. They had to like rebrand their careers basically. Didn't they come back as just the Chicks? Am I misremembering that?
I don't remember.
I
I don't
just
even remember them ever coming back. I just remember seeing it on the TV show that they were like un-American, and that if you didn't stand in solidarity with like the US empire, you were a terrorist.
that was
Like,
when
that's like what Fox News was saying.
and I remember I was living in the DC area at that time, and they were changing French fries to freedom fries at like the cafeterias at all the
Yeah.
Capitol buildings. But I digress. You could go on the
All right.
on the historical aspect for a while. But I think going into the actual movie, Two Towers, which I think it's sort of like I was describing before we started recording. Movie is kind of like a bridge between the two, and there's lots of stuff happening. There is lots of action, quote unquote, as far as battles. The famous Helms Deep. But do you think this movie, or even the book or whatever it is, just sort of framing it between the two, and what this is a very broad question, I apologize, but what
You're
as
fine.
far as what do you think is sort of like the important takeaway of the progression of the fight, I guess, against sort of Saruman? How do you interpret where things land after the movie or the book?
I think, I mean, if I'm following what your question is, it's a bit of a reach, but like so is most of like my Marxist adaptations of
No,
this movie
please.
by calling them the vanguard. But like it shows what it means to be principled, and because they are all still principled, they are also maintaining the same end goal. They are able to successfully be able to make good moves to uplift each other, even though none of them are close. Like they're still like all on their own individualist kind of journey because they all got split up, but they're still doing things that are working towards achieving the end goal.
Right.
And I
No.
think that's a really interesting thing. And that's a big theme throughout this movie.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was, in my head, and you said it beautifully. That I think, we talked about in the opening episode and about the first movie, the Fellowship sort of being this, the Fellowship being sort of like the vanguard party, the group of different people from different backgrounds all coming together for a common goal, and they're split up at the end of that movie. Frodo is off with Sam, and the other two hobbits are Pippin and Merry are off on with the orcs, and so everything is fragmented. But like you said, they still have the goal in mind. There's no deterring them at all. I think it's kind of a sight to be seen that they're willing to still do whatever it takes.
Yes, I agree.
The beginning of this movie also, we kind of touched on it a little bit in the kind of the political aspect, but the movie in general, kind of the opening, kind of gives this feeling of the good versus evil. And maybe we don't want to spend too much time on talking about that, but I think we talked in the first episode, sort of the allegory of the ring being sort of fascism or the takeover, or whatever you want to call it. So in this movie, especially because of the way it was portrayed in the media, it was this good versus evil. But I think it's kind of a short-sighted way to look at it. I mean, yes, there is good and evil, but even within the arenas across the Middle Earth of the quote-unquote good, there's still problems and there's still things that aren't ideal. If you catch that, does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand why Peter Jackson did it, especially like given the climate that it was created in. When I'm talking about it, I'm saying like the movie. This was also amongst the rise of moral panics. There was a resurgence of like the satanic panic, so everyone was embracing like this white Americanistic, or what am I thinking, like ultra American evangelicalism. So a big theme in that is good versus evil. So it makes sense why the film was constructed that way, and they really hit on that point, which Tolkien also agreed with. And like that, you can see, I'm rambling. Hold on.
No, I know, but no, I think it makes sense. I mean, it is similar to the era that Tolkien was writing the books, right? You're saying, the good of
yeah, because there's
fascism.
like a rise of fascism and also like Christianity. Like they tend to go hand in hand, but we're also seeing that with like the rise of the U.S. empire in the early 2000s. We're seeing it again now. So I think it makes sense why they really clung to that theme in this movie, given the political climate that it was created in.
Yeah, no, I agree with that that take on it as well. And then sort of
that was very long-winded. I'm so sorry.
No, I think the question might have been more long-winded. No, you're fine. So the sort of the book, I don't want to talk too much about the differences, because the book is definitely structured differently than the movies. Whereas in the book, things were happening independently, whereas in the movie, you don't want to just show it that way. Everything kind of has to be happening all together at the same time. So, the one of the first kind of pieces of the movie is, we have Pippin and Merry are escaping the orcs, and they end up in the forest with the Ents, which we're going to talk about because the Ents are so awesome. But also we have the return of Gandalf, where he meets up with the rest, the three, Gimli and so on in the forest as they're trying to find the hobbits that are missing. And I think it's a good point where I think we should talk about the progression of them going to bring Theoden back from his spell of Saruman and Wormtongue. And then after that, I think we should get into some of the Ents too. So you were telling me, or you were suggesting sort of how Wormtongue might be perceived. So he kind of has this spell that he's using through Saruman to talk to Theoden to kind of control him and put him under his thumb. What did you make of sort of how Wormtongue might be perceived?
I think if you were to draw connections to different political topics that Marx has often referenced, he makes a really good example of like lobbyist, and Theoden representing like the highest power of that land being like the bureaucracy, and how lobbyists can pay their way and manipulate these bureaucrats to be able to serve them and the interests of their rulers, which would be like the economic ruling class.
I mean, to take it even, I guess even further is, or maybe this is not exactly directly linked, but you sort of still have, you mentioned sort of like the bureaucracy of the kingdom. I mentioned maybe in passing, is that, there's still problems and there's still things associated with some of the kingdoms of men, like Rohan and Gondor. They have their own disparities between the wealth. And one thing you do see when they arrive and then when they leave Rohan is the working people that are sort of following, and then you also have sort of like the people that are in his circle. And Wormtongue is enabling Saruman to control everyone. So he's really controlling. I don't know. Is Saruman like the capitalist who's pulling the strings through the bourgeoisie of Wormtongue, or is that too far?
I feel like I'm picking up what you're putting down here. Yeah, it makes sense because like ultimately like we think that the ring is symbolic of like fascism, and you can't have fascism really without corporatism in this political climate. So the economic ruling class play a really big role in this, and they're going to do their best way to deceive the masses and to keep them off of their trail, keep them preoccupied with fighting with one another and distracting them from what's really happening.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense. And it's hard because it is a monarchy. So whatever the king says is right. But I feel like a lot of that mentality never really got stripped and deconstructed after we left Britain. Like that mentality still exists today. Like we still believe the highest figures of the land.
Yeah, no.
So I think it makes when we draw these comparisons, it's not too far fetched at all.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly wasn't. I'm sure this wasn't on top of mind on, the writing or the depicting, but in terms of how Wormtongue is sort of using, the words of the whatever he's saying, like you said, they do as they're told as subjects to the monarch, and so if they say to do this, they're going to do this, and I think one of the both in the movie and the book, I love the scene in the book when he brings in they let him into the room to see Theoden, and he has his staff. He's like, oh, you wouldn't I don't remember the exact line. He says you wouldn't
take a staff from an old man or something.
Right. Yes. And they specifically said like, don't let him bring his staff in. And, he has his moment to bring him back. And it's such a cool scene. And I think it's sort of freeing for him. I mean, he's still the king, but I feel like he now has the ear of Gandalf. So it's almost like he's replaced him, but with, Gandalf has, good intention.
Yeah. And like with him lifting the veil, it also showed everybody in the room, like they were all enlightened as to what's happening, because who knows what they were able to know about what was happening in the world with at like the border of like Gondor and Mordor, so, like who knows what they knew. So this was able to show them like, this is a problem, this is happening, we need to rally behind and act quickly so that we can combat this evil threat that it has pervaded our own society, and we need help the rest of our community. That's why like the riders of Rohan end up going and helping Gondor. Right. After like they defend Helms Deep. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself.
No, that's fine. But no, it's true though, because I mean the other thing I was gonna say is it possible, they don't really allude to this in either, this is maybe another stretch, but obviously the king is under this spell, but in doing so, like I said, because whatever he says goes, even though he's not really saying much, he's kind of just whispering to Wormtongue, but presumably the people who are sort of his most loyal are just going to believe this either blindly or because they're kind of also cast under the spell in some sense.
Yeah, I would agree. I like that analysis.
Because I mean, like you said, it's a land where you don't really have any information other than what's given to you. It's not like they can wake up and check the Rohan newspaper and say like, oh, well, this is what's happening in our local community. But yeah, so I think the veil being lifted is such a cool, such an awesome scene. I think in the same moment that this is happening, we see the ants. Well, actually, maybe before that, was there anything else we should touch on in that before? I know, because then with the next sort of pieces, they're going to start marching after they convince Theoden to leave, but he decides to go to Helm's Deep, which was sort of his own way of saying, you're going to do what I say. in an instant. He's
Yeah.
still exerting his power.
Yeah, in the best way that he seems fit, even though I mean I don't know where they would have sent them. Like I
Right.
understand why they went there. It was like
Yeah.
this giant fortress. I just think they underestimated what was to come.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like even Gandalf really probably didn't realize or know exactly how big of a force Saruman was building. And I think that's when he maybe had this inkling, however he seems to receive information, he then goes off to try and, bring this alliance to help save the day at the end of the thing. But it's almost like he seems to know more than he lets on at the moment he's letting it on.
Yeah, that's the way he runs. I don't know if like Maya like are telling him or the Vala are still telling him or when he had like his sick acid trip when he's fighting the Balrog at the very beginning and he like lives 2000 lifetimes if he became enlightened then. I I have no idea how he knows everything.
Right,
But
because the only thing he didn't know, which I thought was super funny, is he didn't realize that Sam had gone with Frodo, but he knew like where Pippin and Merry were. He knew all about the Ents and all this stuff. He knew all of this information, and I think you're maybe right. He was living, hundreds and hundreds of years of life. It's almost like he was enlightened. He had this epiphany. Here he might be ripe to have sort of that Christian allegory of, he is this enlightened being that has more power than others.
he does. He does. And I think Ian McKellen compared wizards to bureaucrats, which I mean, I understand. I understand it, but I refuse to believe. I refuse.
No, no. I mean, maybe the only way I could see that is because they had like their order that he later, it kicks out Saruman from. So maybe within this order, there was sort of this quote unquote bureaucratic nature. But this will be the one time I disagree with Ian McKellen. So sorry, sir. Or I think he's been knighted twice, so he's that cool.
Yeah. But now we can move back to the ends.
Yes, yes, please. I maybe I dragged that on too far. But the
No,
ensign,
you're fine. The eco socialist of uh the Middle
yeah,
Earth.
yes. I was hoping you would say that word because it was the exact term that I wrote down. So that makes me feel better, but not better. Just confirmed that I wasn't crazy. But the Ents in the book, is takes up a lot of time, and I get why they had to not have hours of Ent conversation in the movie, but they're so cool, and I feel like the way they depicted them was awesome. I just love the Ents.
They're so special, and I do wish they would have included more of like what they are and how they operate because you get a lot more of that in the extended edition of like how like the Ents were like the sheep herders. So like at the end, you wonder where all the orcs go after the Battle of Helms Deep, and like there's this whole forest that just happened to move and like just yeets all of these orcs and urukai and goblins, just decimates them.
Yeah, and I mean, in I don't remember since I only watched the extended edition. I don't remember what was included and not, but in the extended version at least, they do explain, which I think is sort of like a really cool story about what happened to the Ent wives and sort of why they don't have baby Ents anymore, and it's also in the movie or sorry in the book, they only kind of allude to there being a few left. Although I feel like in the movie they kind of made it seem like a larger force, which I totally understand. It wouldn't have worked as well, and it was, sort of like this little Ent army, which I thought was, when they got angry. They're so angry seeing their friends killed. I mean, that's a pretty powerful. You literally see them being burned by Saruman and the orcs.
Yeah. And when you like when they're talking about like the Ent wives, and like the role that they played in Middle Earth going through like the first age, where like the shit that what cut that out.
You can
Like
the bad words are okay. It's all
butcher
fine.
that. I know. I was like, what am I saying? The Ent wives, they taught a lot to men with like how to do like agricultural work, which was really important for their ability to survive. Whereas like the Ents were really busy just like shepherding trees, which makes it seem like the lesser trees are like animals or something. It's very interesting, and like the role that the elves play with the Ents, like they aren't just like this
Yes.
completely separate being. Like they all interacted together at one point in time in Middle Earth with the dwarves. Everybody knew of them, but then I think it was after one of the first wars with Morgoth. All of the Entwives got wiped out. They all got burned alive by a dragon. So they kind of just congregated in Fangorn Forest, and that's where they stayed.
Yeah, and what I love in the book too is they kind of talk about how, they've kind of like gone to sleep. They've kind of, all the trees were once alive, but they've sort of just forgotten this part about themselves. And it seems like this conflict that Saruman has created in Middle Earth has enabled them to literally awaken from this, decades, centuries long, quote unquote, I don't sleep. I don't know how you would describe it. But the one thing too that I don't, this is maybe going too deep into the Ent lore, or maybe there's no such thing. So you're saying how they teaching agriculture. Do you think that they presumably they didn't know what a hobbit was? And there's a whole thing in the book where they didn't know what a hobbit was, and they sing the song, and then they add the hobbits at the end of their long song. How is that possible?
I
Right?
don't
Were they
know if it's
so
because of like
good at hiding?
it could be that like they were really good at hiding, or possibly like where the Ents existed during the different ages didn't coincide where the different like fractions or species of hobbits were. Like they just existed on outer planes, because it doesn't even really talk about like which Vala or Maya made the hobbits. They're just like an offshoot of like a little bit of dwarf and a little bit of like elvish, because they like live so long, also a little bit of human. Like they're just like their own being that somehow fell out of lore. But I do think like the point you were saying about how like all of the trees woke up, because and like the speech that the Ents are having, because their language is very long, they're kind of discussing whether or not they need to be involved in the affairs of others, like be interventionist in this war. And I know in the film, like Merry and Pippin have to really like hone on them, like you have to do this because it's going to affect all of us at one point. Like you can't just not do anything and be passive about it. You can't bury your head in the sand. Like eventually this will affect you.
Yeah, I think the difference between how that scene kind of culminates in the book and make or sorry in the movie, it makes total sense. And it seems like they intentionally lead them towards not towards Mordor, towards the tower, Orthunk, and that's when they see the destruction, and it leads them to finally make the decision to do it. Whereas in the book, I think I promised I won't do too many comparisons, but I lied, I guess. But in the book, they like have this long speech, and they're so angry that they make that decision on their own faster than they might normally, because of how, they could lose all of their end friends.
And I think that's where like I question whether or not Peter Jackson was putting like the political climate of whether or not like the United States should intervene. Maybe it was just like a way to get like
Oh,
the viewers to make that connection. Like, should we do that? Because it's very weird that he made that executive decision to write it and direct it that way in that political climate. You following me?
yes, no, that kind of just blew my mind actually. And that is, I can't. It would be impossible for me to think that that's an accident. And I didn't see anything in the interviews I read with Peter Jackson about that. But that does make sense, where it's like you can't just make a quick, hasty decision to do something. You have to have a measured approach.
Yeah. But like unfortunately, like the measured approach would be like to go to Iraq, I guess. I have
Yeah.
no idea. Like if that's like how it's being depicted. Because there's like some questionable things in the film. Like the way they depict like the Easterlings
Yeah.
and the
No, that
hologram.
yeah, that
And
was
like
actually a perfect segue, because that was exactly what I was going to say.
segue.
Was so we have, you're saying how, which I think I totally buy it, that they or Peter Jackson decided to make this conscious effort to say we have to make a decision of whether we're going to go and fight someone who opposes us, who has a mortal would put us in mortal danger, and that was the message of America and the Britain and so on. But then we jump over to Saruman, and I think you just brought up the point of the Easterlings and the Hadarim. Is that Haradrim?
They're the ones with the
Yes.
elephant.
Yeah, I
I
know.
can never
I'm
pronounce it correctly.
yeah.
But yeah, you like Frodo and Sam end up seeing them like when it cuts to their portion, like their storyline. They get to see like these humans, because they had only seen like quote unquote good human, good men And now they're seeing like these men that work for Morgoth and now like Sauron, and they're still working for them.
Sam alludes to the fact that they had heard stories, or there was sort of, this is, one of those things that no one ever believed was actually a thing. And I think you pointed out, and I think it's a good observation, that the questionable aspect of these depiction of them is very much that of, and maybe not just like Peter Jackson is pulling this from the book, obviously, but it's could be seen as a bit of looking at the othering of people from, Asia, where you would see it reminds me for some reason of the movie 300, where they're fighting against Persia, the Persians, and they have their elephants and all these things. So sort of just like the way we view that culture.
I agree. And I think it makes a lot of sense when you see how Tolkien constructed Middle Earth with the West being like the good. A lot of them are very like light and pure, whereas like the East is where like Mordor and Morgoth, like they tend to settle in the East. And now you're having like Easterlings and Haradrim, like who live there. And like some of them like didn't really have a choice. But like all of the bad is in the East.
Yep.
And all of the good is in the West because that's where Numenor is and whatnot, or what was Numenor. It's a good criticism that I completely understand and support that a lot of Marxists make on this like trilogy, both like the books and the movies. Like that's a very fair, good faith criticism to make.
Like you said, if you look at the map of Middle Earth, it's pretty hard to. I mean, he was basing it on, the United Kingdom and Western Eastern Europe. And one thing I just wanted to point out that I didn't maybe realize, but this makes complete sense, is that the hobbits being in sort of this, agricultural sort of commune type of society, which we talked a lot about in the first episode, was sort of Tolkien's image, or what he sort of dreamt about, or what he hoped that society could go back to. That's what we were before, industrialization and all of that. And you have them all the way out in the West, near the water. So
yeah, I see that.
But the aspect here of the kind of depiction, I think, is a reasonable criticism. And now you sort of have the Ents coming in, and they destroy the left of the army that's left in Isengard, and so they take it over, they flood it, and all that, sort of bring back, locking Saruman and Wormtongue into the tower. And so I kind of lost my train of thought, what I was talking about there.
I think I see where you're going. Like they saw all of this like ecological damage that Saruman, who was supposed to be sent by the Vala, the Maya, to help serve them, like they're like the higher beings, and they're going against that code of like preserving the world and taking care of it. And there they are poisoning it, so they go and just like fuck everyone up.
No, that's it.
Everyone gets the wall. You're all going under.
That is exactly I feel like I had like 5 more minutes to get to that question, but that's exactly right. And I even wrote down in my notes about sort of the flooding of it. In my head, again, I don't know why I thought of this, kind of comparison to like the Bible of, Noah's Ark, flooding, God floods earth. He's sort of to set things back. Obviously, this is a very small scale little city, but he's bringing it back and, getting rid of the evil that is the orcs that are there who've been destroying their land. So yeah, I think you said it better than my analogy.
That would make sense because in like Christian mythology, one of the theories as to why God is flooding the earth is because angels were breeding with humans, creating the Nephilim. But in the cellar, like down in Isengard under the ground, Saruman is helping to create Uruk-hai, right? Which is like this hybrid between human and that. So it would be interesting if he was drawing the connections between the Nephilim and like the Uruk-hai. I could not validate that. That's just
that's
that's what it makes me think of when
there have been things said that there was obviously lots of Christian elements to these books, so that wouldn't surprise me. Whether it was a complete intentional thing, who knows? We unfortunately may never know, unless there's some, he mentioned kind of how he was thinking of it. But so now they've flooded. I know we've kind of been sliding through the plot of the movie, but so they've now flooded Isengard, and so now they can kind of clean up. And the thing that I like in the next, I think so. There's the next sort of bridge in the movie is the Saruman. Oh wait, in the movie he doesn't go to. In the book, Gandalf goes to see Saruman. But that doesn't happen.
I don't think it happens until the extended edition. Um, which I don't know if they talk about it, but in the extended edition, it talks about like it doesn't talk about it. It just shows Wormtongue like pushing
Mm-hmm.
Saruman off of the cliff or like the top of the tower and dropping the Palantir into the water as a means of like reconciling the Palantir and like how they obtain it. Like it wasn't just chilling on the water and Pippin just walked up and grabbed it. It explains it a little bit more. And in the book,
He throws
I don't remember. I think Wormtongue just
right. He does. He
throws
throws
it
and
over,
he almost
and
hits Pippin. I think with it,
Saruman,
right?
yeah, I
But
think
this is
so.
where
He
he's
gets out of the way.
casting Saruman out of the order. He's no longer, and they crack his staff as well, so he no longer has his same power. He's sort of rendering him somewhat powerless. I mean, I don't think that's completely the case.
But in the films, he's just gone. They're just like, yeah, we're just gonna kill him off. Like, no, we're
And so
done.
he's now stuck in his tower where he sort of, kind of remains for the rest of the movie. You don't really see him much, except the only thing that you kind of bring back is as they're plotting the army to go to Helm's Deep, you do see Wormtongue sort of feeding them information that he knows about Helm's Deep. It seems like he knew very well the strategy of Theoden and what they would do, how they could. And I know he actually creates that little bomb, right? He builds like a TNT little bomb, like his fiery explosion device. Yeah, I feel like I feel like
I don't
in the
remember that
towards
part.
that he like has some device because they're saying like we can't breach the wall of Helm's Deep. It's too thick. And he has like there's like the moment where they're in later in the battle. The guy's like running and
Oh
they're like
yes,
shooting the
yes,
arrows at him, and he plants the device or he lights it on fire and then it explodes in the
yeah. It's in like the little
yes, like the
waterways
little
underneath.
like the one channeled again. I know that was a lot of thing there, but I think the the next part of or the final finale and sort of like probably everyone's favorite maybe favorite part of this movie is the Battle of Helm's Deep. It's pretty epic.
This is the one where uh Orlando Bloom does the big shield
Yeah,
slide right down
yes,
the
and he's shooting
stairs.
arrows at the same time as
Yeah.
he's just like wiping people out with his shield. Yes.
And Gimli's like, throw me. And Aragorn's like, what? So silly.
We also didn't mention this. I think you did in the previous movie, previous episode. Is that Aragorn is 87 years old, and if you watch the extended edition, they say how he is that. And I think we didn't really talk much about the elves at all. So maybe it's worth kind of bringing them in a little bit. I think it's going to be more important to the final book and final movie. So I don't know if there's anything you wanted to bring up about the elves as part of as how they kind of play here because they do get involved in the Battle of Helm's Deep in the movie, but that does not happen in the book.
It was a really interesting creative decision for them to do that. And I still am trying to reconcile why they did that because I can't understand why they couldn't have left it to be how it was and how like Theoden's nephew ended up bringing a bunch of people, like the townspeople that originally watched Helm's Deep, right? Didn't they in the book? They left, they dipped, and then they're like, okay, we came back. But it wasn't elves, like it wasn't the elves of Lothlorien. It wasn't Galadriel's soldiers, which is maybe it was like a way of like them coming out of like their little like safe place and trying to show that they want to fight and stand up for what's right because they can't talk about what was happening with Galadriel at that time. Like I don't know why they did that.
So the theory I have, and this is wasn't from Peter Jackson or anything. I've kind of looked around, and so the theory that I've kind of pieced together is that at the time, especially in the book, there's lots of battles happening across sort of Middle Earth. Well, this is sort of like the coolest and probably the best one to depict. The primary battle, and it's happening like the elves are being attacked, I believe, as well, but far off. So I think it was almost like they needed a way to show, I think as you said too, is that all of the different races were coming together to fight the common enemy. And so bringing them in.
Yeah, because I think in the books, right, weren't they fighting? orcs and goblins that
Yes.
were from Mordor, that were coming from like the necromancer place, or they were coming from Moria or something. So they had like their
Exactly.
own front to fight, but they couldn't include that in the film. So I
Yeah.
understand it. I don't know. It's just it's a weird way to
And it's
reconcile
a
it, I guess.
shame. No,
Not
no,
trying to be
it's
a
so
Tolkien purist,
I
but
kind of
like
felt the same way because I read the or listened to the book right before I rewatched it, and I was like, oh, this kind of gives me a bad taste in my mouth. But again, I do understand it, and I think they also I like the book version if only because it kind of shows the will of men to have been able to do it on their own in this stacked odds, whereas the helping of the elves kind of takes that away from them because the elves are constantly talking about how men are corrupted and can't fight back. They're kind of incapable. And I feel like that kind of takes it away from them.
it does. It kind of like places that element of like elves being saviors to humans. And that's like why they were sent from the Valinor over to Middle Earth in the first place. Like why they had to come was because they had to come fight Morgoth, and now they're like fighting again. And I don't think Peter Jackson thought that through, but that would be a resulting theme in that moment and would carry through the rest of the films. Was that like elves being saviors, maintaining that hierarchy of like Tolkien's races?
Because that's they're always made appear to be sort of this higher being. They live, forever, presumably. And they have this mystique to them, and they made the ends. It brought them into existence, so it gives them this power that I think kind of, it kind of takes it away from the men.
Yeah, I agree. I
Yeah.
think we're on the
So,
same page.
yeah, I still love the movie, and I still think the scene is awesome. That battle is awesome, especially like when all the elves are lined up with their bows and they shoot out. It's still pretty cool to watch, and I'm willing to forgive it.
It was a cool battle scene, right? For entertainment purposes. It's like watching the Super
Yeah.
Bowl.
Yes. Yes.
Woo!
Yeah. I feel
Sports.
like that. Like if you watch the trailer, I feel like 65% of the trailer is like from Helms Deep, just because it's. I think that's probably spent most of the money from that move. From that movie on that. So, I mean, it's visually, it's pretty amazing.
It is. That's how they had to sell like Lego sets and like D&D play sets, like all that good stuff. They
Yeah,
got to
you
get
got to
the
have
merch.
the well, like there's like a risk version, but it's Middle Earth. I'm pretty sure if they're I'm sure they
Do
do.
they
I
really?
I feel like I've seen it in a store. I'm like, I have Risk. Do I really need this version? But yes,
I have the Lord of the Rings Monopoly, so like there's
yeah,
always room.
yeah. The problem
There's
with
always
Risk
room.
is, I mean, I guess like Monopoly is that it's a very long, epic game. So,
Yep.
but one thing we didn't really talk about at all, and I think maybe this is one of the last kind of pieces. I don't know if there's too much at the end of the portion of the battle at Helm's Deep, but we didn't really talk about Frodo and Sam's journey throughout this movie, as well as the Gollum, Smeagol. So there isn't that much to talk about in terms of where they're going. They're kind of initially very lost. They come across Gollum, who's been following them, and they opt to sort of treat him poorly and decide to tie him up with the elves' magic rope and have him lead them. But what I was curious how you perceive the Smeagol Gollum character and sort of his representation throughout the books or movies, just generally before maybe talking about the movie itself.
Well, I think, I mean, as with most of the themes in this book, his character is depicted a lot differently. I think, firstly, like Frodo ends up viewing him very, like, with a lot of compassion when he has carried the ring with him for a good portion of time. Because now he's like, okay, Schmiegel, or Gollum as he calls himself, has carried this ring around for 750 years. I could only imagine like why his brain has been so perverted by it, with it speaking to him, and like the burden that can weigh on you. And then also like Schmiegel, as you see in the very beginning of the third movie, so unfortunately we have to like talk a little bit about it, but like he is like a hobbit. Like that's the race that he is. So like I think they see a lot of themselves and him, and like him opposed to like the orcs, which are just intrinsically evil. there was a good side to Schmeagol at one point.
Yeah, Frodo I think that in general, hobbits have this way about them where they do always want to see the good in people. And so I think in the books, especially, like you said, Frodo does see the good in him. But in the movie, they definitely treat him much more unkindly, especially Sam, like the way he, wants to keep him tied up and the whole thing. It's almost uncomfortable. I felt a little bit sad watching. I mean, I know that he eventually does betray them in the next movie or in the book as well. So he's not perfect, but he's still tied to the ring. So you almost can't blame him.
Yeah, and like you understand, like Sam is trying not to let down Gandalf, right? Because that's what he says at the very end of the first movie. He's like, "I told him I wouldn't leave your side," as he's like drowning in the water. So he's like trying to fulfill that his destiny or his promise to Gandalf, which he doesn't know is still alive, and he just wants to see Frodo, who he loves dearly, succeed. And I can understand his skepticism, but also like he takes it way too far to the point where Frodo is easily manipulated by Schmeagol as time progresses.
Yeah, he puts more trust in him than he probably should, but at the same time, without him, they would never make it even half as far, as they end up getting. So I think it's you can't really blame him. He has this. I think there's a scene in the movie where Frodo lashes out at Sam, and he kind of apologizes later, saying like, "I didn't realize how much of a hold the ring has on him." I think that's kind of they don't get into it as much as they do in the book. I think it's more implied. So I think the only thing we didn't talk about, I don't know if it's worth bringing in, we didn't really talk about Faramir and sort of the little bit we get. We get like a flashback of Boromir, where I feel like I sold him out pretty hard in the previous episode, maybe for good reason. But I feel like he and his brother have some daddy issues, as far as the way their dad treats them. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's worth briefly talking about before we wrap it up.
I know we hit on like all the good points that we need to. We could talk about like Faramir, like he proved something really important, which was like men's corruptibility. Like you see that in like the very beginning scene, like of the nine, like the Nazgul, they were all of men that went and like wore their rings of power and they became part of like Sauron or yeah, Sauron's
Yeah,
army. Where Faramir, he proved something that like men can overcome that.
yeah. I think that could be a good wrap up because it is kind of showing that despite all the good that the men have shown throughout this book or the first two, they still have they're still corruptible. But I don't want to talk about like the human nature thing because
Oh, human nature. Humans are inherently greedy.
no,
Like
no, it's
like the capitalist.
yeah, no, I don't want to go on that. But yeah, so I think maybe like a minute or a couple of minutes on that. I think we got all the things and
Yeah, because there's no point in talking about Shelob.
no,
Like
no.
that can
I
be
think
saved for
if we
another time.
do, it kind of yeah. That's like the first, and it's yeah. Shelob always. I wasn't that young when it came out, but I feel like I don't like spiders that much, and that always creeped me out. Anyway, so
Yeah,
yeah,
she's
yeah.
scary.
So the last thing we'll kind of touch on, I think, as this already happened a little bit earlier, but the final finale of the movie is basically Faramir, who is Boromir's brother, lets the Hobbit. Sorry, not the Hobbit. Oh, Jesus Christ. He lets the Smeagol and the two hobbits, Sam and Frodo, go. With the ring, knowing that their task is bigger than them, and he realizes what he's done. But you mentioned how Faramir shows is a good depiction of that men are still corruptible, and he wants to prove to his father that he can do something. And throughout the movie, we kind of see the strength of men, but they're still weak in some senses.
Yeah, so there's like a lot of work that they have to do to overcome all of like this history through the ages of them being so easily corruptible and they can't really like hold their own as well as they could. They're always like in need of help, outside assistance. But Faramir does something that his brother can't do. And even though his father really wanted the ring so that they could guard their front. Faramir saw that his brother got corrupted very easily by this, and he's able to resist the ring, which is a very easy task, especially when you look at how Boromir was so easily corrupted just within being within walking distance. And Faramir, I believe he mentions it in the book. I don't know if he does it in the movie, I don't remember, that he was able to overcome the test that his brother couldn't pass. So in that, he knows that his brother or his dad is going to be upset with him
Yeah.
that he didn't fulfill this. But he's like, this, as you said, is bigger than all of us, and it needs to be destroyed in order to like nip the problem at the roots rather than just deal with the oh goodness, where am I going with that? Like the repercussions. Where am I thinking? You know, they're not like trying to like do flex tape on the problem. Like
Yeah.
they're solving the issue at the root. I don't know how else I was gonna word that, but it was definitely not like that. It was a lot more uh it was better.
No, I understood what you were saying, and I think you said that his dad's going to be mad. I think his dad hates him already. Well,
Yeah.
another failure in the life of Faramir. But the what's interesting too, what was I going to mention is that so they in the movie they don't really he doesn't say how he was able to withhold it, but I believe that Sam tells him that what happened and why how his brother had died. He was corrupted by the ring, and I think that they don't really do a great job in the movie of using that as to why he makes the decision he does. But I think that is, he sees that the corruptibility of it, and he's afraid that it will kill him too, or kill his father, or kill many more people and cause more harm. And it's pretty commendable that he makes that decision because a lesser man probably would not.
Yes, and I hate that they depicted him the way they did in the films because he is like a crowd favorite amongst like the Tolkien community. Like Faramir is goated. Like he's a really good character and he's written really well, and like the way he leads his team and he treats everyone like the same. Like he's good. He's just a good guy.
Yeah, they have him like
And like they don't
threatening.
do
Yeah,
that in the films. So you're missing that nuance. So you're just like, oh well, he's kind of like a bootlegger for his dad, trying to make his dad happy, and then oh, he's gonna have like one little redeeming arc. And that's what
yeah,
I got from it.
yeah.
Like the first time I watched it, I was like,
Yeah, I
are we
couldn't agree
sure?
more. I feel like they really just did him dirty. They kind of turned him into like a little side character as opposed to giving him, the respect of what he did. But, again, the movie can't have everything. It's not perfect. It can't be as perfect as its initial.
I know we can't be utopians as Marxists, but I sure sometimes I question that.
Yes, we have to look at the movie and its in the form that it was created, and and again, like if they had made the movies when the books were created, I think it would have been a different. I know there are other movies that have been made, but not to this same level. But I think that really, I think that we should be impressed, listeners, that we filled out this movie. And I mean, maybe there'll be some completionists that said we missed some things, but that's okay. We filled out this movie, I think, pretty well in the our hour or so here. But to do you have any final thoughts on anything we missed, or anything you'd want to bridge before we get to the final episode, down the line?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I think we did a really good job at highlighting, which is like one of my goals is to be able to highlight some like geopolitics, which we did in the beginning, connect it to how like art can be influenced by like what's happening in your current like material reality. We got to talk about a lot of big ideas that were present in this very slow paced film that a lot of people don't like. And I think that's what makes it good. If we can find a different way for people to view it and pull more out of it, that is all I could ever hope.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally true. I think that viewing it from that dialectical. If there hasn't been a book written called like the dialectics of Tolkien, there should be. Someone needs to write that book, going further. But I think looking at it from those like those higher threads and themes, I think does show why this movie makes a lot of sense. Not just as like a filler, you know, but as a real connection of where all the different characters are. I think mentally too. We didn't really talk too much about Gimli or Legolas or Aragorn really in this, but I think this
Well, there's
movie
a
sort
lot
of
of character development
there
that's
is
happening here.
there is yeah. That was kind of my point is that that is more of that was a highlight of this movie is seeing especially for like Legolas and Gimli become like I think this is where their friendship I think becomes especially in the book it's even more so where they're promising to go to each other's homes to experience what they both do if they survive this whole ordeal, which I think is so beautiful.
It is. It's a nice way for them to bring it back where there isn't like this infighting amongst dwarves and elves, which has
Yes.
been seen throughout Middle Earth history.
Yeah, I think you really see in this movie the willingness of the different races to come together. And I guess maybe with that, maybe I'll be okay with the elves joining Helm's Deep because it does build that or ferment that bond between the different groups that are fighting Saruman. So, with that long-winded conclusion, Hungry Rye, thank you so much for coming back again to do the Two Towers. It was great.
Thank you for having me again. It was fun. I'm excited to hopefully do another one in the probably in the new year.
You'll hear this episode, and presumably a month or two after that, you'll get the final installment of The Lord of the Rings, which I will have to add here is the best trilogy of films ever made.
Yes, and regardless of what Matt says, the extended
Yes.
editions are better.
Yes, we maybe in the extended edition of this episode we can talk about that.
Okay.
I promise there isn't one, but yes, again, you've been listening to Left of the Projector, and we will catch you next time.